I was not yet 20 years old. Being just a poor kid to a second lieutenant pilot, it was pretty awesome. The B-17 was tagged with the name the Flying Fortress. I have read that that was the product of some newspaper reporter who just kind of put that name on it. It stuck, and I will say that we got the most press, the best exposure of any airplane during World War II. And of course we hated that, you know that, yeah. What was special about the B-17? Well, it was the best bomber we had. I looked on airplanes as the coming miracle because I was born and grew up during a time when a Model T Ford was our best transportation on the ground. So to leap from a Model T Ford to something that flies was pretty special. I was born in the deep part of South Texas, outside of a town called Harlingen. My mother and father migrated from Louisiana, 6 boys, and I grew up a little painfully being the youngest of 6, but it was okay. We were a very poor family down in the Rio Grande Valley, extremely poor. I use the term dirt poor even to emphasize. So, but things got better when we moved to Houston. During those early days when Germany was becoming a known danger, I think we as individual citizens, and particularly as young boys, were not too conscious of what was going on. The great memory day for all of us was Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. I think that is the point, the turning point, at which we as citizens, whether we were young boys or older, I think we began to realize, hey, this thing is real. England had been struggling all that time without our help. And if we hadn't come in and engaged ourselves, England would have gone under, I feel certain. When I was given notice that I was to report to be drafted, I was about 18 years and maybe 4 months old. Well, I guess I asked to be assigned to the Army because that was the entrance to the Air Corps. I took a test with 16 young fellas. 4 of us succeeded and 12 did not. The test progressed up the line eventually to where I was accepted as an aviation cadet. That was really the beginning of my success story, I think. My brother, he was always known as WT. That stood for William Townsend. He was 3 years older than me. We became pretty well attached to each other. Of the 6 boys that I grew up with, he was the star of the family and had been awarded a full scholarship at Rice Institute, we called it then. He separated himself from college a few weeks short of graduation. I've never known why, but he volunteered. He was exempted because of college, but he entered the Air Corps and became a pilot also. He flew an airplane that we called the B-25. I remember the day that I was advised of his death. I was called into a high-ranking officer's office, and that frightened me. You know, have I made a mistake or something? But he handed me a copy of a telegram. Killed down off the coast of New Guinea. I still remember the date, November 13th, 1943. Here I was within a couple of weeks of being sent overseas to Europe. Carolyn was to come home to prepare to birth our first child. I can think of no other word that it was pretty depressing. I had arrived in England preparing for my first combat mission in 1945. I got over there about the time that our fighter airplanes, the P-51s, had become successful in subduing, to some extent, the German Me-109s. So my experience was not so much the German aircraft, it was with the German anti-aircraft. We called it ACAC. As the Germans were pushed eastward, the Me-109 threat was lessened, but the anti-aircraft danger was increased. What you saw was a black puff of smoke because they sent these projectiles up intended to explode at your altitude. And the Germans were pretty good at estimating our altitude. We were constantly having to change altitude in flight to try to fool them. Sometimes it got pretty thick. So, and if these things exploded nearby you, they were full of all sorts of scrap metal and floor sweepings out of machine shops, just anything that would damage an airplane. I never had a single impact from any of this anti-aircraft. I don't know whether God cared who got hit and who didn't, but I thank him that I didn't get hit. I had to fly as co-pilot on that first mission. I remember it quite well. Went to Kiel, Germany. They were reported to be the headquarters of the German submarine compact, what the Germans call a submarine pen, where they actually ran their submarines into these mountains, for protection. They were trying to bomb these submarines out of business. We would assemble by circling, gaining altitude all the time, and then we would head eastward. The first thing I ever saw in combat, 2 airplanes down in a lower squadron that I could see very easily just by glancing to my left, had flown together and become entangled. B-17s had 4 huge propellers, and they would chop anything that came into interference with them to pieces. The next thing we saw was these parachutes coming out of these 2 airplanes. I guess there were a total of close to 20 guys. That sort of introduced me to the reality of what was over there. Flying at a height of probably 28,000 feet, we dropped our bombs hoping to hit these German submarine emplacements and disable them. So we returned back with no further event because it was mostly over water. And so that pretty well describes the first mission that I flew on. All over the European continent, there were pockets of resistance of German forces that had been sort of sealed off by our military. The city of Amsterdam was still under German occupation. The Netherlands, a great deal of it is the lowlands, that's below sea level. The Germans had ruptured a lot of dikes and flooded the farmlands, and the people had lost the ability to produce sufficient food. The German soldiers were there too, and what they were doing for food, I guess they were running a little short also. An agreement was worked out whereby we would carry huge packages of food over Amsterdam at very low altitude, 200, 300 feet. The Germans agreed to not fire on us. And we had to fly over with our bomb bay doors open, our wheels down, and all of our guns pointed upward. I don't know how many trips I made over there, 2 or 3. As we flew over at this very low altitude, we could see these Germans tracking us with their guns from their pillboxes. The one that I would have to say that thrilled me most, shortly after the war ended, The Germans had captured French civilian men and taken them back to work in their industrial plants. Two things happened. It was reported that General Patton's movement eastward had run him short of supplies. He had overrun his supply lines. So they would load 200 of these 5-gallon GI cans of gasoline on our airplane, and we would fly down to Linz, Austria. And then, after ventilating the airplane, they would load on about 35, maybe 40 of these French men. And we were to fly them back to small airfields around Paris. They were happy to be gotten on board. They were, I think I sensed a degree of fear in some of them. The thing that brought a thrill to me that I remember best was when we would land at these small airfields, very incompatible with a large bomber plane, but we would get landed. I couldn't even get the engines stopped before they were pouring out the back of that airplane, running as hard as they could to the edge of the runway where people were lined up waiting, hopeful for their loved ones. It looked funny at the time. We all laughed, I know that. But later, in reflection, it caused me to really understand in a different way what freedom meant. These guys were seeking freedom. And I'm glad I got to participate in that flight particularly. That was the best flight I ever made. Some years after I came back from World War II, it began to burden my mind because I began to be aware and conscious of and concerned about the damage that we did in World War II. It plagued me for a long time that I had participated in something that took the lives of a lot of people. I wrestled with that a long time. But I finally resolved it in the gift of Jesus Christ. That's why those two humanitarian missions, particularly the second one, I embrace it with an armful of love, because for me, I wouldn't say it equaled the scale of balance, but at least I had participated in something good. The bad stuff was behind us, and I thank God that it is behind. Romans 8:1. Where it's the greatest promise that I know. It says, there is therefore now no condemnation for those in Christ Jesus who lived not after the flesh, but after the Spirit. I call that the linchpin of my faith right there. I want to leave with you young folks. I hope each one of you prosper in life to the point to where you can look around and see if you can lift somebody's load. That's the greatest thing you can do on this earth. To make somebody else's life a little bit easier. Tranquility Prayer says, Lord, help me change the things that I can change, and help me to live with those things that I can't change. And give me the wisdom to know the difference.